As he said, my name's Derrick. You guys doing good? Yeah, awesome. Thanks for coming. And a little bit about what you see today in me and what we provide here at Taco and other areas is I am a now unbelievably multi-time amateur national championship winning shop in the most premier racing classes in the United States of America. We have won championships in 250cc 4-strokes, 85cc 2-strokes, 65cc 2-strokes, 125s, 450s, and that process is unbelievable to me today, because if you told me that 20 years ago, I could never even dreamed it. To be at the top of an industry in any way, I'm not saying that that's where I'm at, but to have won in those areas is really cool. And kind of to back up how I got there was the same as anybody else. How you love motorcycles, how you got into dirt bikes, how you got into anything, same thing I got into this industry. I loved dirt bikes as a kid. I loved toys. I loved model airplanes. I built my first balsa wood airplane, took like 6 months from me and my dad, and I crashed it first time we flew it. You know, like everybody else who probably got into that. That transitioned into RC cars, and then that transitioned into dirt bikes, and that passion never really left. I went to school for engineering and grew up in a household with 2 PhD parents who are a chemical engineer, PhD. My dad's a mechanical engineer, PhD. My uncle's a PhD in engineering as well. So I, of course, didn't get an engineering degree, never finished. I'm the dropout of the family. My brother's got a degree and my cousin's got a degree. So I went the motorsports route, but it's unbelievable to me that we've slowly but surely built into a shop that's able to compete at the highest level in anything that we've done, and I think that's really cool. And the answer to how I got there is just plain and simple: never stop learning, never stop adapting, work really hard every single day. So I learn every day. I'm here at Tacomoto this week learning, and what we try to do for anybody, but here at Tacomoto specifically, is tailor what we work on for things that we think you guys want. So realistically, if you have questions, if you have anything you want to know, that's what we're here for to do. And more than happy to try to answer it to the best of my ability and hopefully best of Dusty's ability. And some of these questions might be more challenging than we truly know the answer to, and that's great. Take that back, go work on it, and get better at it. So anybody have any questions right out of the gate that maybe they always wanted to ask and no question is too dumb? And probably some of the questions are going to be too smart for me. So what do you guys got? Anybody want to go first?
You work with ECUs?
I work with ECUs. I work with Get ECU a lot. I work with some other stuff, but for the most part, I work with Get. And to truly become an expert in any field requires a lot of time. And so to truly become an expert in the Get side of things, because there's a lot to ECU tuning, has been let me think about it now. That has been a 12-year relationship, really since these bikes went to fuel injection is kind of where that relationship started for me. But I also, as a shop, primarily how I make money is we build high-performance racing engines as well. So we do engine R&D from porting and camshaft development and piston development, and we do our own titanium connecting rods and R&D and stuff like that. So we design and conceptualize, get made. We work with a lot of vendors to do that. I obviously don't produce all those parts, so I work with some of the best vendors in the world to get great pistons. And if anybody had questions on there, I'm happy to answer that. Those are some pretty neat questions that I really nerd out about. The best way you could look at me is I'm just an absolute engine nerd. I absolutely love everything about it. And that passion has just carried me through my business through the early days, which were really tough, and slowly built that into a company that's had some decent success. So great question. What do you personally ride with?
A Get.
Okay, awesome. Yep, so I work a lot with Get, and I work with Mike to deliver what he believes is the vision that his clients want. And so we work we're all the time. I mean, I think kind of a joke or that we're going to say was like, you see this behind Mike. This is not staged. This was cleaning up. So this stuff was all over the shop and here and the bikes, and you're looking at like, there's also the cans to those, right? The silencer cans. You're looking at each one of those is $1,000 essentially for each bike. And you're looking at basically $4,000 in ECUs sitting there. Of course, he's got hundreds of them around here. You've got throttle bodies and intake tubes and 2-stroke heads and 2-stroke ECUs. And the cost, how the sausage gets made is much more complicated than I think people would really, really even ever appreciate. And it's more even complicated than I appreciate. When we got the AIM guys here, the Get guys from Italy, we've been lucky enough to go see those facilities. It's unbelievable the amount of technology that goes into a little ECU box, the amount of staff, the amount of engineers, electronic specialists. I mean, it's truly a phenomenal product. You should see when the guys are trying to create a new ECU for these bikes and they have these wires coming out of everything and these scopes and breadboards and they're developing how to even make the bike fire up and start, which is actually something the AIM guys got to do here this week with the CRF 450X. They took a bike that they couldn't get to start, didn't have protocols for, didn't have pinouts for, and by the end of the week they had made that. And if you got to see that, even if you don't like electronics, you'd have been mind blown. So yeah, anybody else got anything else?
Why do you choose Get over other platforms?
That's a great question. So when I first got into the ECU business, I chose Get because at that time, they were the technological leader of all the options I had looked at. So when you looked at what Vortex had, which was the other player in the space, and then what Get had, really the only two aftermarket players in the space at the time, Get had a lot more features right out of the gate. They had their traction control, the GPA is what they call it, and then of course they had some Wi-Fi stuff that came out very shortly thereafter. And then at that time, if you go back in time, the US had been Vortex dominated kind of once people really caught wind of the four strokes with EFI. However, in the early days, when four strokes first went to EFI, it was like dominated by Get. So all the Supercross championships and outdoor championships are actually won by Get in the early days. So like 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, when Star Racing Yamaha came to prevalence in the pro side, that their first 3 or 4 championships.
That when it wasn't available to the public either, it was just race teams?
Get has been available, but here in the US, for various reasons, they just haven't been as marketed as well. So not as easily available, right? Distributorship's tough and things like that. So Vortex had a much stronger stranglehold on the market because of their shop affiliations who are all in California. So California being the absolute hotbed of motocross side of things, and I think all things motorcycles, off-road related. They just have always had a really strong magazine relationship, shop relationship, and those types of things. And then of course, various politics, various things. Most of the factory teams, not all actually, Get is on Honda factory, but most of the factory teams are running factory ECUs nowadays in the racing sides. I mean, there's, Kian being a player, but also Motec, Magneti Morelli, they're like a big time car supplier. They're a player too. But to get back to your question, I worked with Get early on because I felt like they were a technological lead. And then over the years, I think that's been maintained. I mean, they're always a step or two ahead of the other companies when it comes to releasing features, cool map switch stuff, CAN bus, Wi-Fi, smartphone tuning, which maybe doesn't appeal to everyone. But on the back end of what I have software-wise, I really like some of the features and functionality that they've developed and created and honed over the years. What makes them really challenging and what makes it a harder box for most shops to work for is it's so complicated that you can get lost very quickly, and it gives you almost too much control. So sometimes you make a mistake and you screwed something up and then you're going in circles saying, man, what the heck did I do here? Where another ECU didn't even give you that option. It just is the way it is. It either works good or it doesn't, and that is what it is. So that's something that they've done a good job with when you're really trying to fine tune, but at the same time, it can also get you lost in circles at times. Anybody else?
You fine tune with the Get ECU on a dyno so that the settings for this bike's ECU may not translate over to another bike.
Like the same exact bike, but another one?
Are they like motor specific when you can tune them to the motor?
A little bit. So for the most part, and this comes down to brand specific bikes sometimes, KTM has done a really, as a group, KTM, Husqvarna, Gas, have done a really good job of creating a package that's almost the same on all the bikes. I mean, when we've really looked at them, you might be seeing trims, like you might have trims of 3, 4, 5% maximum between fuel injections, fuel pumps, little odds and details. We have seen more variants on some of the other brands, like Hondas and stuff like that, although I think those details are specifically in idle, and we can get into that in a minute. But basically, they're all really, really similar. Now, if you start customizing your bike, that's not really something that has been through the ringer and really heavily developed, then maybe there's some nuances to your bike. So you throw a totally different pipe on it that isn't something that's been tested. Way different size header and big core.
Different compression.
Whatever, right? And compression, maybe not so much, although again, idle specifically, very sensitive on these bikes to little changes in the idle area. So for example, this bike is a really cool bike. This is a unicorn bike here at Taco right now, just built it this week. This is an SXF head, it's a 500, but it's got a 450 SXF head, camshaft, rocker arm arrangement, but it still has the lower compression standard 500 piston. Just changing over to that netted almost no peak horsepower. I mean, pretty much identical, although it did have about 3 horsepower up the curve, so I mean, you'd take that all day. But that said, the tune difference was pretty dramatic. So just that camshaft change was like 10, 15% of fuel changes across the vast majority of the tuning board. So when you first fired it up, it didn't even idle. So that's, that type of change was big enough to influence it to where it needed a specific tune. So if you wanted to build that and you're like, hey, I already have a Get, but I'm gonna go throw all this head on it, you would need to make some tuning adjustments to make your bike functional for you. I saw you had a question?
Yeah, as far as the traction control goes, if there was no wheel speed sensor on the front, what does it reference it from, or how does it know when you got?
That's a great question. So our industry, rules-wise, from where they got their start, outlawed wheel speed sensors. So, and they also outlawed traction control. So that's why Get's official name was Get Power Assist for the longest time. Because in the rule book it said traction control, it didn't say anything else. So that was their workaround. Yeah, AMA, and here in the US specifically, Europe, anything goes. So that was their way around it. And then of course, how do you do it? Without a wheel speed sensor, what do you do? So number one, it's patented. That's something that they uniquely own the patent to, and so the other manufacturers can license or have to come up with different ways. So the early days on how that worked is like if you had an OEM bike, and then the rules changed to kind of continue on your question. The rules changed to say you're allowed to have traction control, and this is a few years ago, if the stock bike comes with it, and magically overnight every bike started having a traction control button. But if you actually tested that pretty extensively, the traction control button was like gear-specific mapping, and what they did is like in first gear, second gear, third gear, first gear they'd pull 5 or 6 degrees of timing out, second gear they'd pull 4 degrees of timing out, third gear they'd pull 3 degrees of timing out, and then fourth and fifth gear would be the maximum timing for power in their opinion. So they basically just gave you like a little less power in each gear, and they called it traction control. But because of that, then the race teams could go legally, without even having to hide it, say, yeah, we're running some really trick stuff. Get has some algorithmic control. So is it as good as what super bikes and sport bikes are doing? Absolutely not, right? Those things are phenomenal. That's a whole nother level of ECU tuning. But it does use rate of change of RPM, rate of change of throttle, gear selection and input, and then of course, what's nice about the Get product, in my opinion, what really separates them versus the other ECUs currently is that it's adjustable on your end, level 0 through 10. So you can say, I don't like stock traction control, it's just too much. I turn it on or turn it off, or I can't tell the difference, one of the two. On the Get, you can go like 0, 1, 2, 3, right? I feel that like you can tell 3's on, but it's not invasive. You go to 5, you're like, oh man, there's times where it's like really doing something, and I may or may not like that. And you go to 10, and you're like, man, this thing's really doing something. I really notice it. It's slowed the bike down quite a bit. It's different, it's funky, but for some people, that's the correct amount. So that's a great question. They're basically using a host of inputs to give you the result you want, but then they also allowing you the option to fine tune it for how you want it to work for you. And I think that that's probably something that a lot of people miss, but I think in my market, we work mostly in the racing side on like my business side of things. Obviously I work with Taco quite a lot. In my business, I think our industry is, the 450s are way too fast. For the average consumer, I think the bike is just gonna get you hurt. And everybody, they get on it, wow, it is exciting. But at the end of the day, you go faster with a slower engine. The 350 proves this. Most vet riders are faster on 250Fs when they do true back-to-back lap times. So I think they should buy an ECU just to slow their bikes down. It doesn't win shootouts that way. It's not exciting. You don't hop on your buddy's bike and be like, oh, that bike's sweet when you go do 1 lap. But when you go race, you go do 5, 6, 7 laps. It's very noticeable. And I think the traction control version of Get is nice because you can have all the horsepower you want, but getting there can be managed through the push of a button. So that's a great question. They're doing a lot of algorithmic control, and then because they're affiliation with race teams over the years, both in Europe and the US, they've really honed that algorithm over the years to make it as good as they possibly can. Anybody else? I think you might have had something? No? What do you ride?
A few things, but a 500.
500 is one of your bikes? Awesome.
So you mentioned most people would like a 350 or 250 or whatever. So have you specifically worked with detuning the 450s down to what a 350 more so would have?
Yeah, so I work really hard at that with clients in my area, and our goal is to, obviously we provide different maps, but our goal is to make the 450 as 350-esque as possible. Now there's limitations there.
I bought a 24 gas and I hate it
right.
because it's just too fast.
Right.
That's specifically
right. And so I actually...
I came off a 350 that was perfect.
Exactly. And I think the 350 is like, the problem is you get that, competitive spirit where your buddy's got a 450, so you're like, oh, I gotta have the 450. And there's once in a blue moon where you're like, oh man, the power's so awesome.
My e-bike was better than I got with the 450.
Yeah. So I think that we do work on that. Obviously there's inertia differences in the crank, and there's differences there, and where it makes power in the RPM range, how much you can rev it and all that, they're just different. It's a bigger engine, but you can make the delivery, and that's a great question. How many of you guys here have a Taco ECU, a Get, an AIM, anything? Okay, you do. Anybody else? Okay, great. Have you guys played around map 1, map 2? Are they Gets? Okay, do you feel a difference between map 1 and 2?
Big difference between
Oh, yeah.
the race map and
Yeah, because map 2 is the traction control set to 5, and then 1 is just
Right.
whatever the taco tune is.
Right.
But through an ECU, can you make my 500 hit more like a 450? Because I miss my 450 hit.
There's probably more differences in the bike.
I know. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not a 450.
There's crank inertia differences. There's a bigger, heavier flywheel. Some of these things that affect it. And then, although if you were to if you were to go ride this bike, it probably would make you feel like it was what you're talking about. So this one's got the cam and the punch and the. When I rode this around today, it was actually like, oh yeah, that feels like more than 500.
If I had any regrets, is my 500 doesn't hit like my 450.
Right.
And
Right. And so I think Dusty will talk on this in a little bit, and we'll go into it about some tuning things there. But to answer, I was going to, you both have it, you notice the difference. So what I wanted to kind of touch on is a little bit of the taco sauce. This is what I've learned working with Mike. And so when did our relationship start, Mike? Like
3 years ago, 4 years ago?
at least 3, probably 4. So let's say 4 and maybe even push it down to 5. I came out of the world that's like, I want the back's power, I want it fast, I want rocket ship, I want it tuned to perfection. So that was the world that I came out of. And I came into this world and we make our early maps with Mike that way. And he's like, yeah, that's awesome. But hey, I really need, which is what Mike's secret sauce was. Mike clued in on this. Mike's like, I'm tuning, I'm playing. I really need my bike to be better for my guy. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I have that ECU so tuned, it's perfect. And he's like, no, I need something better. So the taco sauce and like map 2 and like the vision behind that, and to give you an example is, if we were to dyno this bike, and we could pull up these charts, Dusty could probably pull these up. If we go through all the throttle positions, so you go through 10% and 20% and 30% and 40 and 50, all the way up, you'll notice an interesting thing about 4-strokes is that they make almost the exact same power at any throttle position up until an RPM. So from like low RPM where you're first to get onto the gas up until say at 10% throttle, it might be 4,000, but like 50% throttle darn near makes the same amount of power as 100% throttle and actually tracks exactly the same all the way up until say 7,000 RPM. And then it starts to diverge. And that divergence comes from the fact that we're limiting airflow, but the engine did not need that much air at the lower RPMs, so partial throttle is enough air to make horsepower. So the question is, well, heck, how do I manage that horsepower? Because you don't just go at 3,000 RPM in the single track and in the rocks where it's slick and you just don't go, whop! You don't need that. But that's really what you're getting if you do a full power tuned map at partial throttles. So at lower RPMs, you're getting a ton of horsepower until you really modulate it, right? If we're cruising around here, you might get 5, 6, 7% throttle when you're going 50 miles an hour down the road. So the taco vision, Mike's vision, and then what we've worked really hard at with the Get platform, and I think we'll probably start working in other avenues, is we have made it so that when you go 10% throttle, pretty much everywhere in the dyno curve, it's 10% of your max power. And then at 20%, it's 20% of your power. And at 30, and we're not talking like, you can't do it all the way up the curve, but we're talking that initial little bit of delivery. So there's actually a separation in power between throttle positions. So the goal is to make it that you have like dial of power. I want 5 horsepower, I want 10 horsepower, I want 20 horsepower. Whereas if you do just a maximum effort tune, you're gonna get almost, you're gonna get 10 horsepower no matter what throttle position you go to up until an RPM. And so that's really what the big difference is in map 2. And of course, traction control is trying to do some of the similar things, but it does it on demand. So sometimes it's not everybody's cup of tea. So map 2 is not only GPA 5, but it's also a lot of work on the back end to make very deliverable power. Now, some people come in and say, hey man, this map's just no good. It's slow. I mean, it's not the same. I don't understand. And the purpose behind that map is that. It's to give you more resolution to how much power you have. So you can turn the throttle a lot more and get 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15 horsepower by turning your hand. But at like a full power setting, you barely turn it and you jump 2 or 3 or 4 horsepower. So that's kind of the magic behind that goal or the goal behind that map. That's what Mike has really brought to the market uniquely, and then we've worked really hard here and in the field to try and make that a reality through what we can do through ECU tuning. And then to answer your question about 450 and make it a 350, same concept. So when we go through in there and tune it, what we're gonna do is make it so that all the way till wide open is a lot tamer. And we're gonna try to make it feel to you like the power's brought down here and moved a little bit up here, kind of like a 350. That would be the goal you would do when you're trying to work on a 450 tune-up. Anybody else?
Derrick, can I say something to that? So every tuning shop out there will glory in the fact that they can make a fast bike. I want to make a slow bike. I want to make a fast bike slow. my knee, I'm dehydrated, I'm not thinking right, and I don't have the throttle control management in that stressful moment to really modulate things so I can, you know, get back to the truck and freaking get to the hotel and into the hot tub. So I can use map 2 as like a safety switch if I get myself in over my head. And I've done it many times. And I have a lot of riders who will tell us they put it in map 2 and they leave it there. Because not all of us are superheroes. Not everybody gets 200 hours of ride time per year. Some of us are lucky, we are lucky if we get out and do 2 or 3 good rides a year. And for those guys, they may just want to put in a map 2 and ride it there. They don't need to get in over their heads. They want a bike that will be safe and smooth.
At the end of the riding day, when I'm tired, I'm in map 2.
There you go. Start at map 1 until you peak, and then it's map 2 till the end.
Yep.
One actually thing that we learned, which was kind of funny, was how would you guys, and this is an open question, so I'm going to try to get everybody to engage a little bit, whatever. Any question you got, go for it. But if I gave you 2 maps and you said, okay, one is fast and one is slow, you put it on your bike, what's the first thing that everybody does? So if I did that to your bike and I said, hey, I want you to tell me the difference between these 2 maps, go rip it around, what would you do? How would you do that?
I'd put it in map 1.
Right? How about you, one row back? What would you do if I gave you 2 maps? How's the first way you would test that?
I'll put it fast.
Okay. And then you put it in slow.
Yeah.
But how are you gonna judge that?
I mean, basically writing the OEM stock,
Uh-huh.
bike in stock, and after that, just compare.
Right?
I'll put
Depends
it
on the,
fast.
depends on the terrain, right? If you're in wide open terrain, you're gonna go map 1. If it's getting tight, you might say, oh, let's try map 2 a little bit and see how that feels.
Right.
You know, track it around a little bit.
Right. So one of the,
high speed, running through some gears.
right. One of the things that we found that was kind of funny was my vision for the map initially was I'm going to make it so that map 2 is slower everywhere until you go wide open. Because if you're going wide open, there's a reason for that. You're like, I need some horsepower. So I can make map 2 make all the horsepower that map 1 makes. But then we had people call up and like, I can't tell a difference. I just put this ECU on my bike. Well, what they did is they put it on map 1, they go, whoop! And then they put it in map 2 and they go, whoop! And they're like, there's no difference. Hey, something's wrong. So we've had to evolve product there too to say, okay, we really do need to tame down to even at wide open, even though in my head this vision is what I think is smart, because if you're getting up on the highway, you want to pass a car and you happen to be in map 2, full horsepower. But when it comes to like the client, you have to meet their demands and needs. And so that's something that we've played around with. But on your 450, like that discussion you had, the great question, which is we can do that. That's something that customized to you, you can make it any variety you want. So if you're like, yeah, it's a little too slow, you can pick that up. Or, hey, I really want wide open to be wide open. Or, hey, I don't want that. I want wide open to still be a little bit tamer. Those are all things that this era here, this ECU era, has brought about to these bikes, which is certainly much different than the carbureted era. You just flat could not do that in the carbureted era. It was not possible. So anybody, anything else? I mean, open book here, open to any questions, shoot.
Yeah, so you got to get an ECU. You have a map switch or an SX1 controller installed. You go into your YGet app and you're, say, switching between the factory maps. Does it change map 1, map 2? Does it change both of them? Can you select?
Great question. So I'm actually going to repeat this. I forgot to do this earlier. So your question was, you have the Get ECU, you have the SX1 controller switch, and then you have a Wi-Fi. And then you put it in there and you go to the factory maps. Does it change map 1 or does it change map 2 on your map switch? Great question. So what happens is inside your Wi-Fi, when you go to the factory maps, and I'm actually not an app expert because I use my laptop all the time, but I do know, obviously I poke around in it. It says FI1, IG1 as your tables you're editing. So if you go into your factory maps, it's going to show you those changes under FI1, fuel injection 1, and IG1, ignition 1. That is applied to map 1 in your ECU or on your controller switch. And then map 2 in your ECU or on your controller switch would be FI2, IG2. And so a lot of times those factory maps are not applied to map 2. Like when you go look in there, they've only given you those in map 1. So if you wanted to apply them to map 2, you would have to create a custom map, copy paste those tables, put them in FI2, IG2 if you wanted it on map 2 on your switch. Did that answer your question? Or?
Yes, exactly. That was the question. If you're changing between factory maps, it's only altering map 1 on the switch.
When it says in the tables say FI1, IG1, that's in map 1. So anytime your tables say that, that's what it does. If you want to do it to map 2, and if I remember right, the app doesn't do those applications, right, to map 2, IG, it doesn't do that. So yes.
It shows them, like I'm looking at it here, you have IG, FI for 1 and 2.
Yep, and then
Pull the factory map. But,
yeah. So go into IG1 and FI2. Are there actually any changes, or are it all zeros?
well, they're all 0.
Correct. Now what about FI1 and IG1?
They're all 0.
Are you in the flat map?
Yeah, flat.
Okay, so flat means zeros. The Italians are a little bit weird, and so
Yeah, we've got some different.
yeah. So if you go to the other ones, but I believe the factory maps are only on one, and factory maps means like pre-loaded on your phone from the Get app from Athena, but they're not obviously stock. They have no relevancy to your stock bike or stock ECU, and they're just generics. They're kind of to give you an idea of how you can adjust your bike. So hey, I'm going to try what it says for sand. Let me just boom, put it in there. Okay, I know what that does. I want to try this one. Oh, okay, I know what that does. Then you can go create a custom map where you can fine tune that. I really like sand and I really liked hard pack. I want to merge those two maps. That's really what the feature is there. It's to give you just a base idea of things to try that you can just quickly search through. Any other questions? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so on those, our position is we've spent so much time developing the throttle characteristic and feel. Those maps are overlays that sit on top of what we've put into the ECU. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We actually get this question all the time, and it's just an education fault on Get's end, my end, Mike's end. When you see that, that's like the last level of tuning you can do. On our end, we have like these crazy complicated tables and all sorts of stuff you can edit. The very last little bit is the icing on the cake, and that's your Wi-Fi app. So we build this cake, we bake it for you, we pick chocolate, we pick vanilla, we pick all the internals and what ingredients go into it. And then at the end of the day, the app is like choosing your icing or choosing your hot sauce for your taco. You can put it on, you can wipe it off, but the taco's still there or the cake's still there. You can't change that. That's what we've baked into your maps. The Wi-Fi is just a layer. It's just on top. It can be taken off like a photo filter. You can put it on, put it off, but whoever took the photo, they took that photo forever. You can't, unless you want to recreate the photo, a whole new flash, can't change that. So that's what the Wi-Fi is. It's just a layer. You can strip it on, strip it off. If you see zeros in your Wi-Fi, that means you've done nothing to the maps and it's not permanent. It's just wipe it on, wipe it off. Wax on, wax off, Mr. Miyagi. Great question.
Can you talk?
Oh, sorry. Let me just say this really quick, and then Dino, you can jump in.
Okay.
And we don't advise or recommend that you use those because again, we think you don't need them.
That's correct. So we put a lot of effort
But
into
what
the
if
base
you-
maps.
We haven't tested with those, and so you might be leaning your bike out, riching it up, and you change things.
Right, exactly. So you are changing. One thing that's good and bad about the Get app is it does what you tell it to do. That means when you lean it out, it's leaner, and you add ignition, it's more ignition. And we already, like in the power map, have found through the dyno and through testing right pretty close to that limit of what is going to make most power. And so you start adding ignition thinking, oh, I'm trying to jazz my bike up or whatever. You might push it over the edge for that scenario. Now, we do put some fail-safes in. This is not to say go add this in your app. And Dusty's going to talk on this later. I think he will. But essentially, we find where max power is in timing and the max amount of timing there is. But typically on these bikes, they're so well engineered. These are little mini Formula One engines. They're really, really fantastic engine designs. They're highly advanced and they're like the latest and greatest and greatest. Only things higher really that you can buy are a sport bike. And those are not really much higher. They're so efficient and so well done that they'll make about the same power with 5 degrees of timing difference. And so we like to find that number, back off a little bit so there's some room for safety. And of course you get bad gas or you happen to only have 87. Now granted, his performance maps are right on that edge. Sometimes those fuels need some timing pulled out in your app. That's what's nice about the app. You go get some really terrible gas, you hear it knocking or pinging, just go knock 4 or 5 degrees out of it. You're trying to get home. But we do try to put a little room of safety, but there's not really more power to be had by throwing more timing at it. We've already kind of put that effort into it, and you'd be shocked if you got on the dyno what the dyno does care about and what it doesn't care about. It's pretty shocking. Same with air-fuel ratio. So anybody have any questions on like air-fuel ratio? I know Dusty's really going to touch heavy on that, I think, but anybody had like any generic questions on that?
Do you know, did you have some viewers that
If you could talk to piggyback tuners and what they are and what they do. We have some guys here that probably bought a bike and he looked in his air box and there's an electric box in there and he really doesn't know what it does.
Dusty is a piggyback expert. He's probably been more involved with a lot of that project than anybody in the United States of America. So I would say that you should direct most of your questions there. What I will say on the subject is that it's an interrupt or it's like a sniffer. It goes between the signal your ECU sends out to the, let's say the injector, and it uses other parameters. So it's sniffing all these parameters, throttle position, RPM, whatever values that it wants to have. And then it takes in a value, does some quick math, which you told it to do, and then spits out the new value. So if you wanted to make it richer or leaner, it basically takes whatever your stock ECU has and then whatever a tuner like Dusty wants to put into it. It's the same thing as a Get Wi-Fi app. It's a layer. So essentially you have a base tune in your ECU, which is what we put in there. And in the Wi-Fi, you can make it richer, leaner, more or less ignition. You can do it different RPMs and throttle positions. A piggyback tuner is doing the same thing. And he can really go into details on more details about that. And if you had any other questions, think about them, rack them up. Dusty's super, super sharp with that stuff. So anybody else? Anything about bikes in general, motors, engine technology?
I got one.
Go ahead.
How about if I'm modifying my airbox?
Yeah, so we did a dyno video for that, and we showed basically all three scenarios you could have, which is like fully corked up airbox, and then we have one with holes, like the factory KTM vented cover, and then we took it off completely. And I actually have videos where then we take the air filter and screen off, so you get to see all of those options. And you will find that for the most part, a couple holes or what the vented standard covers are is about all you're going to get out of the bike. So sometimes like this bike doesn't even have the cover on because we know that it performs about the same. What I will say from the technical standpoint is what really we see when we look at the data in a non-filtered route. We don't have a dyno chart up in here, but these dyno curves here look really smooth, the stuff that you'll see published in most places. On the back end of that, there's all sorts of technology between here and that computer screen that make that look that way. So I built my own dyno, and my dyno, when I first built it, had data that looked like this. My graphs didn't look like dyno graphs. And I'm like, what's going on? So I did a lot of research and reading, and my data was dead consistent. I could do the same peaks and valleys every single time. So that means that's really what it was doing. So it turns out that most of what you look at here has a lot of filtering that goes into it. There's filtering in how they'd pick up the RPM, and there's all sorts of things. So at the end of the day, when the airbox cover comes off, and the reason you really feel it on the track is sometimes there's a little pickup, like a little peak that didn't exist with the cover on. And it has to do with air resonances that the box cancels out when the cover's on. And when you take the cover off, these resonances are not absorbed or damped or gotten rid of. And so you start to feel these little peaks and valleys, like going down a bumpy road. That's kind of sort of what it does when you take an airbox cover off. But there's generally, unless it's fully corked up, which like the Hondas come with like a snorkel and a really tiny lid, there's a lot of power to be had there. But once you get to like a minimum area, then more area doesn't seem to be helpful. That's a great question.
Like on the KTMs, so do the SXs come with the side panel with the louvers?
Yes, they come with both. You have the options. You can switch them out. If you're on a really dusty day, you're going to want to not run that. And really for Baja, I mean, we have some really, I don't even have it on display, but we have some really incredible onboard bike data technologies. That's actually part of the taco sauce, how we get that done there. And we track everything you're doing on the bike. We can sniff if you fart, stuff like that. So people are never wide open. As much as they say they want more horsepower, it's just super, super rare. Even I've worked with the best of the best in the amateur racing world, multiple championships in the pro class, and then we've worked with them in the pro racing side, motocross, supercross, and you'd be shocked. The fastest 250 riders in the world who would smoke anybody on a dirt bike that you know spend less than 10% of the time at wide open in outdoor motocross. So do you really need the vented cover? Probably not. Now, if you're that guy, if you love it, go for it. It's not hurting anything. But if you're doing these long and Baja rides, probably don't need it. Protect your filter. Go a little bit longer in your filters. Great question. Anything else? Anything service, maintenance, anything like that? Go ahead, Mike.
Well, you're talking about air filters. What about guys who think that there's power to be had by removing the backfire screen?
So we have a video somewhere on that. I'm sure that Mike has maybe done one. Depending on your bike and your model, KTM Husky's gas gaskets have a massive air filter compared to most manufacturers. We've done the test where we've done the lids on, off, no lid. We've done the test with the filter filter off completely, no screen, and then we've done the test with the screen, right, to see what happens. There is no difference on my dyno whatsoever between having the screen in there and not having the screen in there. Now, maybe we'll reach a power level someday that changes, but we haven't noticed that. The surface area of that filter, which I don't have out, but I mean, you're looking like 1, 2, 3, 4 like this, and then you're looking really at the port size that goes into your engine is only like this. So the surface area difference is just huge. Now on some bikes, like currently on Kawasaki 250Fs, a little bit of my world, in the Supercross world, these are in use right now today. I probably have a picture of it up on my Instagram. We created that's a pretty big surface area.
On Mike's bike, absolutely horrible filter.
Bring it over here.
Changed a million years ago. This thing still made the same power as
Dusty, bring that over in the camera, they can see that.
What about the funnel web?
That's something that maybe Mike could answer. I am not an expert on that type of stuff. In our world, you do it 15 minutes, you pull this off, you change it, and you put a new one in. We don't even get them dirty. So I couldn't even tell you. I believe the concept being more surface area, et cetera, and Mike could totally answer that. Dusty.
I'll talk about that when Dusty's up, only because Derrick is on a time. He's got to catch a flight to go back to Texas, so we'll conserve his time.
So on that same kind of thing with, you know, like using your butt dyno in like little minute changes. Obviously, you know, the Tacomoto, you put an ECU in it, like Get ECU, and you put it in cap or muffler, and you 38 to 50 RPMs. When you're doing like mid things like this, and you were talking about, hey, we're in map 2, whatever, and you're partial throttle, like, are you ever going to feel any of those little things in those areas specifically? Like you were saying, maybe wide open and stuff, but anywhere else?
Yeah, so like for example,
Can you repeat that question?
yeah, I'll answer the question. Basically, you're asking that some of these component changes, filters, filter cages, vented airbox covers, do they make a ride feel difference, especially at cruise and partial throttles? The answer would be no. The big answer there is if, again, these resonances that occur, that your engine's a pretty cool little device going on, and there's a lot going on there that, like, you know, there's a wave going up and down that inlet tract, and it resonates, and your box vibrates and resonates. So you might go down the road and notice you took the cover off, and all of a sudden at 3,800 RPM at 12% throttle, all of a sudden the bike's like, brrr, like, what's that? That would be one of those little weird resonance things. But for the most part, no, especially when you're cruising around and you're not demanding horsepower. Horsepower is air. So when you're not demanding airflow, and you're not demanding horsepower, doesn't matter what you do to improve your airflow, it's not going to help you out. And this is why actually most horsepower gains are usually seen late in the curve, because that's when the engine's demanding more air. So anytime you can improve airflow, you can make more horsepower. But unfortunately, those gains, like when you know, what did we show the other day, Mike? We tested, this was awesome. So he's already done all this stuff in the past, but a guy showed up the other day, and I'm glad he did. And he's like, man, my 500 doesn't feel like a 500. We had this in his bike, one of these little intake snorkels and a little turbonator or whatever. And so we went through, we dynoed it, and we tested it. And I don't remember the wide open power difference. It was pretty rough.
Is
Yeah.
that from the bald guy?
Yeah, this one is, I believe. So, and all of these lose power up top, and ultimately they're just a net negative on airflow for whatever reason. But they're also a resonant tube, so the length of this matters for your bike. So that's really a lot of what these tubes do, but this one in particular had this little turbo vane, and shops are chasing what they'll claim is more performance or more bottom or more partial throttle power, and a lot of times that's just crap. Now I think in this instance we did find at some partial throttles, it moved some power around, it kind of traded here for there, stuff like that. But a lot of things, Mike had a great thing the other day. We tested a throttle body, it had some mods done to it, and it made no extra horsepower at wide open throttle. However, it made more power at every other throttle position getting to wide open power. But the only time that the throttle body made more horsepower at partial throttles was late or higher in the RPM curve. It was exactly like you had turned the throttle 5% more at every single position. So it was clearly flowing more air at lower throttle positions, but once you got wide open, made no extra horsepower. So the question is that part functional? And the Tacomoto philosophy is, no. If I want more horsepower, just turn the throttle more, right? There's always more until I get to the max. So do I really want more partial throttle power? Probably not. Now, some people might, right? Some people really like the bark or the excitement, but my philosophy, and that's always been, if you want more, turn it more. Anything else, Dusty?
Huh?
Darren. Darren. Anybody got any random maintenance questions? Anything weird you've encountered?
Has anyone figured out, I know Mike had posted about it on Facebook, on the 350, I have a 2020 350 EXCF, it developed some sort of film or buildup on the back of the throttle plate, and I guess it binds up, or if you're engine braking to idle speed, it'll just shut off.
Get? No get?
Stock.
Okay. Mods? Pipe or anything? Stone stock?
Just stock.
Okay, great question. I mean, I think half that stuff comes, it probably comes from your air filter. That oil seeps through, and then dust and dirt and grime and grit accumulates. And so you may, over time, just make that a service item and clean it all. And then the other thing that Mike has really honed in on, I mean, he's the only guy I've ever seen in the industry tackle the fuel pump as a performance item on a motorcycle. But it was necessary. Like, the bikes had problems there. So we have seen over time injectors get dirty, fuel systems get dirty, fuel pumps have less pressure, which, think about it this way, fuel delivery is pressure dependent. So if your fuel pump's a little off or a filter's a little clogged or the whole system's messed up, it doesn't deliver the amount of fuel that it was being told to deliver. So in your case, you may even have a little bit of a dirty injector, you have all these things that need to be cleaned. And it's just something our industry hasn't come around to that much. I mean, it's really like in my world, a 100-hour bike's a crazy high-hour bike. In the y'all's world, 100 hours is just like, man, I just got this thing. It's just barely broken in. It's not even broken in. So those are items that you may just have to go through and service occasionally. And I would imagine that the vast majority of what you're experiencing is just oil that does pass through your air filter, and there's just no way around that.
Pressure zone on the back and it sticks.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly right. So if you think about flow, the plate's closed. Behind the plate is an eddy and a vacuum, and it's a low pressure zone. So actually the flow is backing up, and there's no grate. On this side, air is shearing. On this side, there's nothing to touch it. And then on top of that, the fuel injector. So when your plate opens, it sprays in the bottom of your plate, cleans it. It fuels the solvent. Doesn't spray in the top of the plate, doesn't clean it. So that's something that even carbon wash on pistons is a huge misnomer, misconception within the industry. If they see a lot of carbon on a piston, people say the bike was rich. When they see no carbon on a piston, they say the bike was leaner. That's actually completely opposite. Carbon is a byproduct of heat, and really rich bikes wash pistons so they look brand new and clean. And so we actually can judge tuning on our side by how much carbon we accumulate. It's not perfect, right? We use the dyno and everything, but if I have a bike on, spot on, max power, we develop lots of carbon. The entire top of the piston develops carbon over time. If we have a bike like, let's just give you an, if let's say it was around 13.0 air fuel ratio, just making up a number, but let's just say it was that, okay, we're gonna have carbon everywhere. If we have a 12.0 air fuel ratio, we will have like little areas where it's cleaned, and if you look, it's where the valves are opening, and between those valves where that fuel and air is coming out and touching the piston, it's cleaning that piston, and it's not getting it as hot, and that fuel's washing it off. So carbon's actually, that, and then like your throttle plate is a great example of where that's occurring. Your fuel's actually a solvent. It's a great solvent. It's one of the best solvents. Get oil in your floor and gas wipes it right up. Don't do that, but great question. Anything from online you had?
No.
Okay. Anything else?
Are there any other benefits of like redundancy or anything like that? Say if you have like a sensor go out, like can your ECU calculate engine speed using something else? Say you hit something or rip a wire or have something break. Is that
We had this discussion with the AIM guys. So they have some technologies that allow them to
simulate or emulate like a...
It's pretty tough. But there's multiple strategies to making your bike run. The question is, like engine RPM pickup is like critical. It's pretty hard to detect RPM any other way. So they have some strategies there, but at the same time, it's not easy. So the problem that I will say with the Get in general, and it's not a huge problem, we think it's maybe more a feature than a bug, but some people would think it's a bug, which is it's very sensitive to input. Meaning, if you have a bad crank trigger, it may not run at all, and your stock one might. So people are like, my ECU's broke. No, you've got something else wrong, and it's telling you it's wrong. It's like, I don't want to go ride today. That sensor's way out of whack. You need to look at your bike, and the stock one's going to get you home. Obviously, it's an OEM product on a road-going bike, but it might. We have bikes come in that run horribly on stock stuff. I'm like, how are you riding this thing? Guys are like, oh, I don't really know. And it turns out that their air temperature sensor was broke, and their coolant temperature sensor was broke, and their map sensor wasn't even plugged in for some reason because they forgot to do that. And the bike runs, but I mean, it's down on horsepower, and it's just not really responsive and all the things that it should be. And whereas the Get, I mean, it'll run with maybe one or two of those things out. We have some fail safes there, but like certain key things, it flat out. If it's got a bad crank trigger signal, something's out of whack there, it's not going to be happy. It's like, hey, we don't want to create a fault and cause you to crash today, so we're just not going to work. So that's a great question. And maybe that's something that we work on in the future, like a limp mode, like a, hey, get you home no matter what mode, maybe even at risk of damage your bike, but it'll get you home, that type of a deal. That's a great question. So go ahead.
How important it is to change the ECU if you put like the complete exhaust and like you start adding aftermarket?
Right. Well, we can call it changing to a different brand ECU. Okay, great question. So how important is it to change the ECU? And I'm assuming you might mean the tune in the ECU, but you may mean the ECU, right? When you change the pipe, performance exhaust, free flowing, maybe take your reeds out, right? Stuff like that. Absolutely critical. Right, your bike, unfortunately, I should have talked about this earlier, these bikes are not self-tuning at all. They have zero self-tuning ability in stock form in mod form. We do have some auto-tune stuff you could plug in, but notwithstanding, they really cannot adjust for that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Single cylinder engines are the hardest engines in the world to fuel inject. They're very, 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 very challenging, which is very interesting. So yes, the difference is 38? 38 bone stock on this dyno, maybe 36 right now. This dyno's been a little stingy. You throw a pipe on there and it just gets so lean that it loses power. Like it hates it. It's like it's a performance downgrade. And so you really truly have to go with some form of a get, an aim, a OEM reflash that Taco's really working hard on here with Dusty, or a piggyback, something like that, because the bike just does not add more fuel for the extra airflow demand that is being created. So that's a fantastic question. You pretty much have to do it. Your bike will run worse. And this is something that, a lot of time, for example, these don't make much power difference, this insert. That's really curious. Why doesn't an insert change our power that much? I mean, the difference in noise and flow rate and hole size is tremendous. But sometimes these make more power. Very rarely, but sometimes. Very counterintuitive. But you change that and you can feel a big difference. You go, it feels a lot different. Just that little change there, and that's not a little change, that's a fairly big change, changes the airflow through the engine and changes your tune-up. And so the bike will run either way. It's totally in the window for that type of change. It'll run just fine. But the difference you perceive is like going into your app and saying, I want to try -4 fuel or -5 fuel. Just by changing that end cap, it actually changed your tune-up, and the vast majority of ride change that you feel is tune-up related, not actually that part. So that's an excellent question about the pipe.
Another question: how much of a difference is between like an enduro one and like a cross-country one? For example, an XCF and FE.
On like a 450 or something, right? 350, 450.
Yeah, 350.
The engine configurations are considerably different. So the EXCF, whatever they call these new models, XCF, Ws, whatever, right? They do not have the same camshafts. They don't have the exact same heads. They don't have the exact same tune-up, crank. Compression ratios are much lower. And so they are down on performance. But uncorked to uncorked, 450 to 450 might be 5 to 6 horsepower. 350 might be 4 to 5 horsepower. And if you really get both as good as they can be. But stock to stock, tremendous. Like an XC, that's 450 is a 55 horsepower bike versus a 500 EXCF in bone stock form is a 38 horsepower bike, right? So there's a huge difference in stock form, but when they're uncorked, it's not that big, but there are some mechanical differences between those bikes. So if you want a rocket ship, you kind of have to go the other way, or you got to build these into that, put the parts and pieces on it to do that. Go ahead.
Say you're going to, say you live here, 2,000 foot elevation, you go to Colorado, you're going to ride at 10,000 feet. How does the ECU vary for elevation? Is that like a fueling change, timing change? How does that?
All of the above.
Okay.
Yeah, now we're working on that. We're not perfect at it.
Does it have a map, like a
Yep.
absolute pressure?
Yeah, so great question. So how does the ECU adjust for elevation? That was your question, doing it for the mic. The ECU has a baro sensor on the get. That's the only ECU that offers that stock, and that's one of the technological differences I was mentioning to you guys earlier. They've had that for 10 plus years. So right there on the top of the ECU is this little black thingy. That is a barometric pressure sensor onto the ECU. The bikes do have a MAP sensor, manifold air pressure sensor, inside the intake manifold. There are times where that MAP sensor is reading the barometric pressure sensor. So between those two readings, you can get an idea of what elevation you're at. And then inside our tuning side of things, we have tables that can do fuel trims, ignition trims, things like that, in order to try to adjust based upon baro. Now, this is a little up for debate here in the shop, and we're working on this a little bit. I'm of the belief, so for example, no matter how great you make your bike run, at 10,000 feet, it will be much slower than it is at sea level. The math is very simple. At 10,000 feet, we're a little over 30% less dense air. There's 30% less oxygen at 10,000 feet. I think it's actually 34%, somewhere around there if it's apples to apples. Your bike, tuned to perfection, will be 30+% slower, no matter what you do. So even though it's running good, it will be slower. So we have some debate here. We're going to actually do some elevation testing here, hopefully soon. I think your idle will drop at elevation because it makes less horsepower at elevation. So you might need to adjust your idle at elevation to make it run right, because the bike is 30% less powerful at idle. And so it can't idle at the same speed, because what determines your idle speed is the friction in the engine. Well, that doesn't change with elevation. So at the end of the day, that's something that I think, but we're working on that. We certainly want to make it where you push that button and you go ride and you don't think about it, but I'm not convinced on my side of things that's actually possible. So we're going to find that out.
Derrick, it's 625.
Okay, awesome. Well, I got a jet. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate everybody coming out.
Thanks for the talk.